What's up everybody? Welcome to another tutorial. Today we are continuing the video on the mastering. So in the previous video we talked about rendering stems and some general advice about why you should render stems and doing a mastering project. And this is the bootleg of Jaden Smith Icon, so it's an unofficial remix. This track, anytime you're going into mastering, so this video, we're not going to go too much into detail. This is assuming you have some technical knowledge, you have some knowledge overall on mastering, and keep in mind, mastering won't take a mundane track and turn it into something amazing. The way I see mastering is this, it's just really the cherry on top. It gives it that final polish, you know. An analogy I would use is like you have the car is all made, and the mastering is just those final tweaks, final tuning, you know, final maybe color, that paint on top, maybe it's making some adjustments. It won't turn a garbage track into a banger. There's only so much you can do at the end. So this is continuing from the previous video. If you haven't checked that out, check it out. I was pretty happy with it. It's a pretty minimal track. I usually have much more tracks, sometimes like 50, 60, 70 or more. This track could have benefited from more layers, but I was happy with it. I'm going to play a bit of the drop so you guys can get an idea of what the drop's like. I'm not going to play too much of the main vocals because of copyright reasons. And then we'll go into what I did, why I did everything, and how you can incorporate some of those tips in your own mastering. So the general idea is there. It's kind of like a really banging, simple electro house type of song with a big emphasis on the melody. I wanted the melody to be able to have space to breathe. One tool I recommend all of you guys to use absolutely is Voxengo Span, because Voxengo Span will allow you to, and a lot of other tools can do this, don't get me wrong, but I like it because of the metering just looks really nice. You can adjust it, and it's really good for looking at your RMS. You can just keep hitting reset, go to the loud area of your song, and this track fluctuates from around -7 to -6.5, and that is your loudness. Now, again, if you want to make something really competitive, probably -7 RMS and higher if you want your track to be loud when it's dropping, a guy's dropping it in the club or whatever it might be. Now, I'm not going to go too much into mastering for like Spotify and YouTube and whatnot. What have I been doing for Spotify and YouTube? I've just been winging it. You know, I've just been uploading my mastered loud track to Spotify. Now, the problem with that is that they're going to reduce it, right? When you distribute to TuneCore, TuneCore, Spotify, any independent distributor who puts on Spotify or anything, you give them a 16-bit wave, and they ask, Spotify normalizes audio. So if you have a track that's hitting 0 dB peaks and it's loud like this, -6.5 RMS, they're going to lower that to like -12 LUFS. Now you can monitor that in a program like Fabfilter. Fabfilter will allow you to target a specific range so that you can say, you know what, I want to hit, around -12, -14. The reason why Spotify and YouTube do that, SoundCloud might follow, but SoundCloud doesn't normalize audio yet. The reason why they do that is that they want people to focus on dynamic range. But, I mean, EDM is already loud by nature.
A perfect sausage.
In any case, for now, it's okay if you make a loud track and you use that for Spotify. It's okay. But if you guys are making like acoustic, jazz, classical, keep that in mind. You might not want to pump it so loud. You want to relax the limiter, or limiters, because I'll talk about that. I have multiple limiters in this chain because, again, you don't want it like pumping up so high. You want it maybe peaking around like -12, -10. It can probably fluctuate a bit more, but the benefit of that is that if you're mastering for Spotify, if you have a special client, is that when you aim for that -12 to -14, that way they're not going to reduce the levels so much, and the dynamic range will show better. To give you a comparison, imagine if a track was made for -12 versus a track that's at 0 dB. Spotify really won't adjust it much, whereas the one that's at 0, that's super loud, is going to be lowered to around -12. And then when you compare it, the other one gets squashed. You don't get the benefit of pumping it really loud. You get the benefit of pumping it really loud if it's dropped in the clubs, if it's dropped on SoundCloud or elsewhere. So the platform you decide to put your track on is important, but I haven't been doing that. I haven't been going the extra mile because honestly, if I did that, all I would be doing probably would just be lowering my audio, and I said to hell with it. I'll let Spotify do whatever they do. But it's just something to note in case you guys make music and you want it to be specifically ready and fine-tuned for Spotify, YouTube. So the mastering chain, in the previous video, I talked about how we brought in the stems and we lowered the volume of everything around -7 dB. And when we did that, we're going to take a look at the levels of the audio. So when we did that, we get peaks of around -3, -4, and that gives good headroom entering the processing of the chain, because from there I took the audio and let's see, I ran it through the SSL comp. The SSL comp, I have it at the highest threshold. It's just kind of kissing the mix. You can see there it's barely giving any compression, and I have 1 dB of makeup gain. A fast release with a slow attack, because if you have a very fast attack, that kick, that transient can't punch through. So EDM generally always slow attack, 30 ms, and 100 ms or 0.1 second for your release. I like having the analog button on because the analog gives it a little bit of that noise. It gives it a little bit of that grit. It gives it that analog kind of character, but experiment, see what you like. Next, I don't generally do this. I usually use this on individual tracks. And again, like Hardwell said, there are no rules. So if you want to slap on some weird plugin on your master and you think it sounds good, go ahead, by all means do it. What I have here for my FX chain shouldn't be what you follow, and this has never been the same. It's always different. The reason why I put Supercharger on was I noticed that I kind of wanted the bass to pump a bit more. Now, of course, I could go on the kick bass and add a plugin there, EQ it differently, but I just wanted the overall mix to be a bit more thick. I wanted a bit more fatness to it. I wanted a bit more presence and air, which again, I'll add in the next few plugins. So I put this on, and the next nice thing about Supercharger GT was that you can do parallel compression within this. So there's a knob there, you can do 50-50. And that way, the good thing about parallel compression, I'm going to make a video about that in the next few videos, is that you can give that nice juiciness of the effect, but also while retaining the dryness of the signal. So 50-50. And just like the SSL comp, I have a slow attack, I have a fast release. That's actually the punch preset there. There's no compression going on, there's no saturation going on, but Supercharger can give life, can breathe energy into tracks or even in a full mix. So definitely something to try out. The fatness right here is a EQ curve. So the fat EQ curve tends to prefer boosting a bit of the low, boosting a bit of the high, giving that nice V, you know, giving that nice V tape, you know, that nice ass. So that's why I added that one. And again, it's not really doing much. It's not doing any compression. It's just giving a bit of harmonics, bit of harmonic detail, a little boost there. Next, I added the SSL EQ. I think everyone should look into using SSL just to see the characteristics. It has a very nice sounding EQ. There's different modules to it. There is the EQ on, which turns on all of this, the low frequency, low mid, and high, but I have that off. The only two things I have on here is the high pass. It's a separate module, and I have it at 16 Hertz. It's not a really sharp EQ curve, but what I've noticed, and this is a big tip for any of you producers, if you need the kick bass to pump a bit harder into the mix, you know, sometimes a high pass is important, because think about it, like, you're not really feeling or hearing frequencies below 16 Hertz, and that's taking away from the kick bass, you know, from 20, 30, 40, 50 to 100 to 200 Hertz. So a lot of times high passing your Mix, I always recommend high passing the mix, but we're going to be doing some sharper high pass in the next few plugins. But this gives this weird character to it, a little bit of punch. And just like the SSL comp, I have the analog button on, and that is again adding some little bit of background noise. And when I say background noise, it legit is background noise. It's hard to see right now, but when I start turning on more plugins, and I'll bring up Edison so you can see it's legit that little background noise, like a little noise floor at the bottom. I've never put this on my master, but I did it because of two things. I used a filter here, and I have it at 22 kilohertz and 16. The lowest and the highest it can go, because below that it's off, and higher than that it's off. So just a little roll-off curve to, again, why do we do that? Because after 20 kilohertz, you're not hearing that, you know? And a lot of that high end can add and take away from boosting some of the loudness. And when you roll those off, it's going to help your mix. It's going to help the frequencies inside your mix. Next, I don't know why I added this on. I just kept comparing A-Being, and it was giving a bit of like presence. Sometimes, even if you don't activate a limiter, and when I mean activate, I mean like pump it, right? Like that's pumping the limiter. But I didn't do that. I had it at 0. It's not even activating a peak. I don't even think one peak gets activated in this. However, this plugin added a tiny bit of presence. I was comparing the analog and the modern, two of my favorite modes. I don't use this plugin often. I did more so in the past. But the modern just added a tiny bit of air, like a very tiny bit. And with mastering, a lot of times it's those small little improvements, tiny little, like a little bit air, a little bit of that. You're a little chef in the kitchen adding all these little ingredients. You're like, oh, that sounds good. So I added this on. It added a cool character. Now, this plugin I've been getting used to. It is phenomenal. I suggest you guys try it out. T-Rax, you know, is still pretty underrated, but it's used by guys in the industry like Deadmau5, Moti. The reason why I love this is that it's a jack of all trades. You could literally master just with T-Rax and not use anything else. It's standalone. It can be used in your DAW. It has all the metering you need. It's got everything, and it can do amazing work on individual tracks as well. You know, it really deserves multiple videos, but again, I'm just doing some broad general advice and tips in what I did. So I started off with the quad image. The quad image is a stereo imager, and I boosted slightly the width, very tiny bit. I boosted, and here I dropped the width of the below 120 hertz to keep that in mono. A lot of times that can help the kick and bass to give stereo separation. But again, experiment, see what works with your mix. So next I used a sharp roll-off, very sharp, like the highest order that it can go, 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz, because I wanted to clean that up before going into T-Rax 1, which is a new kind of mastering compressor. It has features to add air, mid frequencies, low mid frequencies. It can increase the stereo separation of your track, which is what I did. Also add some low sub bass with the punch. The analog button, I'm not a big fan of. Experiment with that. You also can make the transients punch a bit more. And we have these two, push and volume, which are kind of like a compressor slash gain knob. It's something that's hard to explain. You just got to try it out for yourself and see. So when I added that, I brought in also the saturator. This did have a pretty good effect on the mix. I brought in the saturator. The saturator is really nice in terms of giving some body. I like the oversampling at 2x. The difference is negligible, though, between 1x, 4x. It also has a built-in brick wall limiter, but I didn't use that. The steel and the iron, there's different types of modes, but the steel and iron are the most subtle. So if you want to like give some saturation to your mix in the most subtle way, steel and iron modes are very subtle. And there's also a gain knob to pump up more and more, but I left that at 0 because I was like, you know what, I just want the most subtle saturation. Like almost not noticeable, but noticeable, if you know what I mean. Waves makes a beautiful version of this. I think they call it the Puig-Tech. This is a hardware analog EQ. It's modeled off of hardware. It's a vintage EQ. And I used 2 instances of this. This is really good if you use this because it will help boost your low end, but not in an obnoxious way, one that is like resonating and harsh. It can be something that even though I'm boosting 30 hertz, it ends up boosting like 50, 100, giving it a bit of a juicy low. And if your sub bass is great, but like you kind of want to give it a little bit more low, a little bit more high. Remember how I was talking about that V tape? That's literally what I did here. I boosted around 4 kilohertz, and it's not a sharp resonant. It's like a shelf EQ, a little bit of a shelf. So added that on. It was a nice addition. I then realized that okay, around my 100 hertz was not as strong, and your sub bass can be great, but you got to remember that frequencies even all the way up to 200 or 300 hertz can be responsible for the bass that you feel, because not everyone is listening on high fidelity systems. People are listening on dollar store earbuds. People are listening on that. People are listening on this. So I did the same thing, same methodology as I was doing here, but I boosted the 16 kilohertz for a bit of air, and I boosted around 100 for giving a little bit of that low mid frequency boost. Moving on, we used equal again a linear phase EQ. Make sure you are in linear phase. I'm gonna double check, make sure I was, yeah. Make sure you're in linear phase to make sure the bass doesn't get trolled or you don't mess with the phase of the audio. Linear phase always when working on mastering. This again, I did a video on this, so check a video I did on de-esser that explains everything why I did this. But the de-esser catches stuff. It's not taming the audio constantly. It's not like the de-esser is constantly running and like killing the highs, because you could do that. Like if I put it here, you're gonna see it's just destroying the highs. But I put it around -5, and what that did was that if there's something that's like a bit too much, think of it as a dynamic EQ. If there's something that's too much high end, just tames it down quickly with a very fast release, 7 ms. Moving on, we have the kind of the final plugins. I had this as my final. This is the classic clipper. So it's like a soft clipper. If you don't know what a soft clipper is, definitely look into it. A soft clipper is basically like a limiter, but it's kind of like the big boy limiter. It's kind of like the, oh, you want to make something loud? Throw me through that clipper, Now, the clipper is great because the clipper, and using multiple limiters, like here, the clipper, then the limiter. Using multiple limiters is a great thing to do. It reduces the load going into the final limiter. And if you have like 3 guys working on a project versus 1 guy, think of it. If 1 guy's working, he's going to get the most tired. If 3 guys are working, that work gets displaced between the 3, and that can reduce the load and give you better results. So I pumped more gain. This knob, basically, when we look at it, this indicates that it's being activated. You can see there. And this shows the gain reduction. And the knob in the middle, if you guys check this out, the knob in the middle is responsible for how sharp the curve is. So if you really want your transients to punch through, leave this to the right as much as possible. As you turn it to the left, it starts to kill more and more transients because it has a more softer curve. I ended up putting this on. I've never used this limiter, but I liked the transparency of it. It sounded nice. The only reason why I put this on was that I wanted a bit more loudness in the track. It was already hitting like -7 RMS, but I was like, I want a tiny bit more loudness. And with anything, crank up the knob as much as possible. Well, not as much as possible, but crank up the knob and see where you hear the kick and the bass distorting. Back it off. Find an area where you like. I liked it at +1.1. Remember that discussion we had about, rolling off on the EQ? In fact, some limiters will have an option that says infrasonic filter, which is a filter rolling around 20 hertz. But I didn't use it here because I was already filtering so much that like this was not really beneficial for me. So they do that because, again, it can make the limiter work extra hard when you're running subsonic frequencies into it that you don't need. 10 hertz, 5 hertz, etc. So they have that, but I didn't want to use it. They had different modes, but the tight mode was very transparent. And we're almost at the dithering stage. We'll talk about that. I didn't use dithering here. Why? Because this was in my final plugin. So I'm not going to be using dithering. Dithering has to be done in the final plugin. And then there's also the ISPL, which is kind of like what Fabfilter does, the true peak limiting, or what Ozone does. But again, I didn't do that here. I want to do those at the final stage. The last things I was using, this is something a bit uncommon that I do. I have a fruity balance on it, so it gets limited. Like at this stage before the fruity balance, it'll hit 0 dB, but it won't be clipping. Okay, the fruity balance, the reason why I did that is that here you can see fruity balance is 0 dB at 80%. And when we play back the track, here's the buildup of the track. It's building up, it's building up. And as we build up, you can see -1. I think I'll go down to -1 dB. I'm doing kind of like a trick. It's almost kind of like a cheat of reducing the break and then coming back up to full volume. A lot of DJs might do this when they're playing live. Maybe, you know, turn down the low frequency or bring down the crossfader a bit and then pump it back up. It's kind of like doing the same thing. And the reason why I do that is that the mix is going to go down a tiny bit, almost indistinguishable, but it's going to provide more impact when the drop comes. And I have a 27% curve. So it comes down and then comes back to the original volume. And that's pretty much it. It comes back to Fabfilter Pro-L 2. Nothing was changed here. It's just the default. I have the transparent mode. The oversampling I have at 2x. Why don't I have it at 32x? I was watching a video by Seven Skies, an artist on multiple labels. Check him out. Seven Skies was talking about how he had this discussion with multiple producers and they came to the resolution that 2x seemed like the best, where it sounds a bit more defined, but it doesn't start messing with like the transients and messing with the track in a worse way. So 2x is my go-to anytime I'm using Fabfilter Pro-L 2 because 2x is just sounds the best in my opinion. You could do 32x, but it really will not provide better sounding material in my opinion. I have the true peak limiting on. Why do we have the true peak limiting on? Because digital audio and analog audio are different. Where a track might visually be clipping at 0 dB, it could actually have more overhead, maybe be 0.1 or 0.2. So that true peak limiting is going to catch that and make sure that in the analog domain, what you get, what you see is what you hear. It is going to be at 0 dB. It's going to make sure it's hard clipped at 0 dB. It doesn't go any higher. That voice crack though. Dithering. So I don't use FL Studio's dithering. You could, if you turn this off, you could use it. But if you're using the features of your limiter, you might as well use the dithering built into the limiter. You can read the manual on their different modes. There are different types of dithering modes, but I just leave it on optimized. And when I render a 24-bit wave, I use 24-bit. And if I'm rendering an MP3, I'll use this same dithering preset. If I'm rendering a 16-bit wave, then I'll change it to 16-bit. But when I'm rendering a 24-bit wave or an MP3, I render the MP3 from the 24-bit dithering information. And when I do the rendering, make sure you turn off any other plugins. Even though Span shouldn't do anything, turn them off. I have Edison for the sake of this tutorial. Make sure you turn those off. Give it a render and you're all set. You have something like a 24-bit wave or something. When you have that, so when you have something like your 24-bit wave, I always like to compare. When I compared my two tracks here, so the final mix is the one that's called Master 324. It's always good to try comparing it to somebody else's mix or your own mixes. And you can see here, visually, we can tell that the dynamic range has been reduced significantly. It already was not that much to begin with, but in the final version, we can see it's louder. It's got that more sausage type of look.
A perfect sausage.
And the fruity balance you can see has put in that work. Fruity balance has reduced the volume, bringing it up again. And it's those small details that can go a long way. For me, the final mix ended up being louder. It sounded a bit more defined, more clarity. And again, you got to ask yourself when you're doing the mastering, what it is that you're trying to fix. But always remember that the go-to that I always do is be mindful of the stereo separation. Always check your mix in mono by merging the master 100% merged, and then you can reset it. What that does, you can hear it in mono. You can hear, is the percussion okay? Because PA systems, clubs, things like that, a lot of times their systems are in mono. And if you have phasing issues, i.e. your sounds are too wide, or your kick, I heard a guy's track on the FL Studio like Facebook group. His kick was like only on the left channel. It was wide, you know? Sometimes when you're a novice, when you're still into this, it's not like I know everything. You know, I'm just going by what works for me, what I've learned, and I'm applying things how I like. And you should apply things how you like. You know, maybe if I was doing this again, maybe I'd have like Fabfilter Pro-Q linear phase, a roll off, maybe 48 dB or higher slope at 20 kilohertz and 20 hertz. Maybe I'd have Fabfilter Pro-MB doing some subtle multiband compression. You have to always look at it as, what are you trying to fix? What are you trying to do? If every plugin has a purpose, that way you're going to reduce the stress you have. Because keep in mind, your ears are a muscle. They need a break. Take a break. And when you're mastering, take a break. I'm guilty as charged. You know, it's a lot of times I don't heed my own advice, and I'm just sitting on there listening and listening. You'll get ear fatigue, and you won't be able to gauge the sound differences in what you're doing. So take a break. It's okay. You know, sleep on it. Come back to it the next day. One thing that I did to my vocal, keep in mind, if you guys like turn down your stems, like you bring down your stems. So let's say this was a stem. I'm gonna call this Mr. Bean, right? Like, let's say we took Mr. Bean from the original project. We have it like how we have here, the stems, and we brought Mr. Bean down to -7. But I'm like, I want to route Mr. Bean into a plugin or a bus. If you end up routing Mr. Bean to this bus and turning it off on the master, don't also bring the following bus to -7. Leave the bus at 0, because that will also bring it down another -7 for a total of -14 dB. So be mindful of these things. And that's what I did here, was that the vocal was cool, but I wanted it to just pop tiny bit more, like so tiny, like +0.1, +0.2. So I routed it to a bus. I unlinked it from the master. I routed it to a bus called Vox Mix, and I put it on this SSL comp, and it was not really doing any compression, so to speak. All it was doing, the compression was almost non-existent, but there was +0.2 dB gain, giving it just a slight little, like, speak tiny bit louder, you know, just a little bit. There was nothing else I did. Actually, I was satisfied with everything except the hats. Hi-hats, I wanted to just boost a little bit of air. So I put the One Knob Brighter, which is just a high shelf EQ. Really cool plugin. You should check out the One Knob series from Waves. And from there, I was just happy with everything. But again, having these stems are great, because then you could be like, hey, I don't like this. I need to adjust it. I need to adjust that. And it speeds up your workflow. It will prevent you guys from being stuck in a stagnant project. So rendering stems, even though it's the point of no return, it's scary. I know it's scary. You don't want to give up that MIDI, you know, that the synths that you have. It's very intimidating feeling. But once you're thrusted into a mastering project, you can definitely get things rolling. Overall, we were left with a mix that, from the original project, the bass had a bit more thickness to it, had a bit more power to it, and I'll go to a project and show you guys kind of an A-B difference between the rough mix from the original project, no stems rendered, nothing, and then this, the overall new master. All right, so here we are. We have the two mixes, and I just want to A-B the difference between the two and show you guys overall what happened, because Master 324 that you see, this is the final master. Rough V2 is basically just a render from the original project. Now Master 3, I'm going to play back, and I'll just keep switching between the two so you guys can get a difference, the idea. Master 3 has a bit more clarity, a bit more loudness. Visually, we can see also the fruity balance, reducing the volume, that cool little cheat trick. Also, the bass on the old song, the rough one, is a bit darker from what I recall. So we'll play back the rough and keep A-Bing it so you guys get an idea. So subtle, not much of a difference. So I hope you guys can incorporate some tips that I suggested here, maybe use any of them. Feel free, guys, to provide any requests. And that's a wrap for this video. Got longer than I thought. If you guys enjoyed these tips that I provided, be sure to smash the like button, leave a comment. Like I said, stay subscribed and hit the notification bell for alerts when I upload the videos. And I'm going to be uploading this track, Jaden Smith Icon, Ali Nadem bootleg, tomorrow on the main channel. So check that out. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.